Welcome, everyone, and thanks so much for joining me for today's Explainer. Today, we are diving into the life of a man who quite literally redrew the map of the world. We're talking about a figure who went from being a vulnerable outcast boy just trying to stay alive on the harsh Mongolian steppe to becoming the ultimate architect of the largest contiguous land empire in human history. It's an absolutely wild story of survival, brilliant strategy, and just immense historical consequence. Let's get right into it. History remembers the conqueror. But behind the legend was a survivor who transformed a divided people into an empire. To truly wrap our heads around the sheer magnitude of Genghis Khan, we can't just look at the armies and the massive conquests. We really have to start by looking at those incredible early survival instincts that laid the groundwork for everything that came later. Section 1. Outcast on the Steppe. The Making of a Survivor. So before he was the legendary Genghis Khan, he was just a boy named Temujin. He was born onto the enormous, wind-swept grasslands of Mongolia, and his youth was just shattered when his father was unexpectedly poisoned by a rival tribe. Almost immediately, his family was completely abandoned by their community. They were left entirely vulnerable out in an unforgiving wilderness. Surrounded by danger on all sides, young Temujin had to quickly figure out how to hunt, ride, and basically just keep his family alive against the brutal elements. But here is the fascinating part. That hardship didn't break him, it actually forged him. This wasn't just a difficult childhood we're talking about, it was an intense crucible. The daily grinding struggle of foraging for roots and evading capture by rival tribes taught him the absolute, non-negotiable necessity of resilience, and honestly, ruthlessness. Those gritty early survival skills would eventually scale up to become the exact same tactics he'd use to conquer the known world. Section 2. Uniting the divided tribes. The pivot to power. As Temujin grew into a young warrior, he had this profound realization. Surviving completely alone was one thing, but true, long-lasting security, that required strategy. It required numbers. See, Mongolia at the time was this chaotic web of scattered tribes locked in constantly shifting alliances. Betrayal was just an everyday threat. But Temujin realized that to survive, the rules had to change. He started making this huge pivot, promoting allies based purely on merit and skill rather than their bloodline, bringing entirely disparate families together. And by the year 1206, he pulled off the unthinkable. He transformed all that chaos into one united force, was recognized as the supreme leader, and officially took the title Genghis Khan. Section 3. The Mongol War Machine. Revolutionizing cavalry warfare. With a fully united nation now standing behind him, Genghis Khan created what is arguably one of the most formidable military forces in human history, and he built it on 4 core pillars. First up, unmatched mobility. His armies didn't march, they rode. Second was strict discipline, which allowed them to flawlessly execute complex, high-speed tactics like their infamous feigned retreat. Third was rapid communication. They set up the YAM system, which was essentially a highly efficient Pony Express-style messenger network to coordinate attacks over massive distances. And finally, highly skilled horse archers who could fire with deadly accuracy while riding at a full gallop. They were a highly organized, totally unstoppable machine. And the result of that hyper-efficient war machine? Absolutely explosive expansion. His campaigns erupted outward from the borders of Mongolia, driving deep into northern China, and sweeping entirely across Central Asia. Think about how shocking this was to the established world order back then. Nomadic horsemen were suddenly surrounding and capturing massively fortified, walled medieval cities, thousands of miles away from their homeland. Section 4. Terror and Trade. The Conqueror's Paradox. Now, as this empire expanded, so did the complexity of how he ruled, leaving us with a very real historical paradox. We absolutely cannot ignore the fear and the power here. Genghis Khan's reputation for terror wasn't just a myth, it was incredibly real. His campaigns were highly destructive, heavily utilizing siege warfare and psychological terror, and resulting in an enormous loss of human life. Yet, right alongside that destruction, he was an extraordinary organizer. He established the Yasa, which was a written code of law. He instituted religious tolerance across his lands, and he completely revitalized the Silk Road, protecting the vast trade routes that allowed for this unprecedented exchange of goods and ideas. So under Mongol rule, this sprawling empire essentially turned into a massive bridge between civilizations. This era, which historians often call the Pax Mongolica, deeply connected Eurasia for the very first time. Because the routes were heavily secured by Mongol forces, you had merchants, craftsmen, and scholars moving safely from China all the way across to Europe. It was really an early, aggressive form of globalization where knowledge, technology, and culture just flowed freely, completely reshaping the global economy in the process. Section 5. Death and Enduring Legacy. An empire outlives its founder. Genghis Khan inevitably grew older, but his military campaigns, they never really stopped. Then, we hit the year 1227. While on a campaign deep in Central Asia, the supreme leader's journey finally came to an end. The man who had managed to transform himself from a starving outcast into a world-shaking emperor passed away. But what's truly fascinating is the intense historical mystery he left in his wake. Even today, over 8 centuries later, the exact circumstances of his death are heavily debated by historians. And there's this incredible legend that the soldiers escorting his body back home killed literally anyone they crossed paths with just to keep his final resting place an absolute secret. To this day, the location of his burial has never been conclusively identified. He simply vanished back into the earth of the vast empire he created. However, his death in 1227 absolutely did not mean the death of his life's work. The empire didn't just disappear with him. Because he had built such incredibly strong organizational and military foundations, his descendants were able to seamlessly take the reins. They continued his rapid expansion, pushing the borders even further into Asia and Europe. The seeds planted by that young, desperate survivor on the steppe ultimately grew into the single largest contiguous land empire in the entire history of humanity. And that leaves us with this final, challenging thought. Conqueror or survivor? How on earth do we reconcile the immense, destructive terror of his military campaigns with the incredible connectivity and progress he ultimately brought to Eurasia? He remains one of the most controversial, influential, and utterly fascinating figures we have in world history. I want you to take this paradox away with you today and really think about the complex, dual nature of the man who literally changed the world. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep learning.